This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update from K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor begins today's show. Glynn talks about the current market prices while also explaining what impacts consumers' meat demand. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, keeps the show rolling as he discusses ants and termites. He has been receiving multiple questions and wants to let people know what they can look for and how they can handle the situation. Ending the show is K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken as he explains what piping plovers are and if they are in Kansas. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Glynn, what are we seeing for the cash cattle market?
Yeah, this past week I would call mixed to steady, depending on what segment of the market we want to talk about. AMS called the Friday Kansas fed cattle market $2 higher, about 223. If I was to give you Nebraska numbers, they'd be ahead of that. So it was steady to up in the fed cattle market this past week. It is of note, we're on the backside of Memorial Day, so that messes the flowing up early in the week a little bit. But regardless, the week ended with a positive tone. The feeder cattle market, AMS called Kansas mixed to steady, depending on exactly which city and weight class I might bring to you here. 2 example lots, 290 head that weighed 774 pounds, went for 306. And then a much larger lot, 680 head weighing 969, came in at 277. Those will both be steady for the last few weeks. The cash markets have had a positive tone. Would be to put a bow on that for a moment. When you flip over to the CME, the futures contracts, we closed Friday on the June live cattle contract at about 215, basically flat for the week. When you flip over to feeder cattle, the August contract was 299, down about $2 for the week. So there was a pause or a little bit less, excitement in the trading world, CME products specifically. When we go to wholesale beef, box beef cutout, on Friday was 366, up about $4 from the week before. And then select was 356, up almost $5. So that choice select spread, sometimes we see it widen further here during grilling season. That's worth watching. But the fact that we saw additional gains in the box beef sector is of note. So to put a bow on all this, positive week.
And I feel like when we've talked about the cattle market a lot recently, we've seen it being steady or up a little bit. Is that something you expect to continue to see as we look into the future, more short term than long term?
Yeah, we're going to talk demand here in a minute. And I think it depends heavily on consumer demand. I would expect choppy waters for the next several months. The near-term supply situation is supportive, but I think we're going to have a lot of variation on the demand side, which we'll talk about here in a moment, that might pause some of that supply-driven, strength. So elevated volatility would actually be my best prediction rather than ongoing kind of nonstop gains, which we've had sort of for the most part since the beginning of the year, at least in the cattle complex. One more thing to note before we move to like profitability in the feedlot sector is the sustainable beef plant that operates now in North Platte, Nebraska, came online here. We're wrapping this up very early in June is when you and I are talking, but the very end of May, that plant came online. And I'm interjecting it because it is, directly relevant to several of our listeners that operate in this region. And more generally, there's been lots of comments the last several years about possibly adding additional beef cattle processing to the industry. The quotes that are out there is once it's fully operational, this North Platte operation might handle 1,500 head a day. So that's a pretty good sized plant. There are larger plants operating in both Nebraska and Kansas, but this is not a smaller one that might only do 20 head a day is the point. So it is worth watching. It's a market relevant one, but it's also worth remembering, ground was broke nearly 3 years ago, October of 2022, and many years of planning before that. I'm only giving us that reminder because it's easy to overlook all the work and the time and the buildup to these. And even though the plant is now online, it's not fully, they're not harvesting 1,500 head yet. They'll work up to that. So these are truly multi-year decisions and then multi-year buildups and then multiple month ramp ups once we start these plants.
Glynn, while you're in, wanting to mention feedlot returns as well. And what are we seeing for steers?
Yeah, so there's a very positive story there for those that are unhedged. So consistent with the fed cattle market's been going up, so you've been rewarded for that if you're unhedged, at least on the output part of this. So as a quick reminder, on our Ag Manager website, listeners can find every month we put out this barometer of feedlot returns, and it's a cash. So unhedged sales, unhedged purchases of both feeder cattle and corn. That's really important to keep in mind, because if my bad Nostradamus comment about more volatility is correct, that hedged or not hedged, decision is very relevant. But regardless, the barometer that I just published this past week would suggest that returns from here in May through October for steers will be north of $200. So just as an example, a steer leaving in June, so leaving a Kansas yard at market ready weights, is projected to have a positive return of $352. And that stays very positive north of 200 all the way out through October. What's underneath that pretty positive historical margin is some moderating cost of gain, notably improved fed cattle prices, and then we did not yet see the escalation in feeder cattle prices 6-7 months earlier with those. The part that changes by the time we get out to the end of 2025, so fast forward out to, say, Thanksgiving, November of 25, those projected returns actually turn negative. And it's not because the fed cattle market, there is a little bit of decline being forecasted, but the biggest change is we're now paying $30 to $35 a hundredweight more for the cattle coming in. So consistent with a much higher feeder cattle market, that sort of catches up in this exercise. And that's just the reminder, right, of this ongoing risk and offset that feedlot managers have to work through. But for the summer and, certainly through Labor Day, it looks like a very positive margin environment for those that were fully exposed to the market.
And a very similar story for heifers as well.
Yeah, it's very similar, and we do put out the exact same information for steers and heifers here. Shout out to Justin Wagner and his team out in Garden City. This is from the Focus on Feedlot survey data, and then I married up with a whole bunch of Kansas market data. So for the real geeks that are listening, you can compare steers and heifers. Most of that difference boils down to historic basis difference in these forecasts, but the general trend I just laid out would be very similar.
Always wanting to also talk about the meat demand monitor while you're in, Glynn, and what are we seeing for willingness to pay when it comes to retail items and food service meals?
Here today, the May MDM report is being posted at AgManager, so it's hot off the press, the latest info. And I alluded to this earlier. My comments and concerns on demand is what gave me pause on the ongoing cattle price increase, and this is a core reason of that hesitation. So the May estimates were consumer demand probably pulled back. So the retail channel, so think grocery store for at home, 6 of the 8 protein sections that we watch here actually had a decline. So consumers were willing to pay less for those items in May than they were in April. And then, as you said, when we look over to the dinner meal, so away from home food service, actually 7 of the 8 meals we had a decline. So the public is tightening their wallet is the way I would put that. And I'm going to talk about some of that here on the very end of this, but demand pullback in May is what the initial signals are. It's consistent with the protein values estimates that we put out every month in the MDM. The importance of price has grown. So we put out this item, this chart every base report, and which of these 12 items are the most important. So pick 4, which are the 4 that are least important in your protein purchasing decision. And taste and freshness always lead. So no part of this is changing. And it's very common that price is the third most important. That also has not changed, but price has grown in relative importance compared to all the other items. Not just this month compared to the past, but it did it in April as well. So basically over the last 60 days, people are getting more price sensitive is the way to think about that. I think that, again, reflects our macroeconomic environment. And to put a bow on that at the very end of the MDM report, one of the things we highlight is financial sentiment. So Shelby, there's a lot of talk in the general media, not just the MDM, much broader, about the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index and how much it has moved and how many concerns there are. Much of that's tied to trade policy uncertainty in the last several months. Well, we asked something very similar, like a subset of those questions we ask in the MDM as well. And in May, only 18% of the public tells us their household finances are better than a year ago. Now, 18%, that's great for them, but that's the minority of the public, right? And that's on par with what the estimates in April were, but that's lower than it was in March and February. So we've had a reduction in sentiment there, right? Fewer people are saying their finances are getting better. And the reason that's important for the meat sector is if you tell me your finances are improving over time, you're much more likely to tell me you had meat in a meal yesterday. And we'll just call out the beef numbers, but I put the same thing out for pork, chicken, and other categories in the report. But for beef, the 18% that said their finances improved, they had 0.85 meals yesterday of beef. Well, extrapolate that out over 7 days, that is basically a 6 meals a week beef approach. So 6 of your 21 meals, you had beef in it. Conversely, the 35% that said my finances are worsening. It's a little over a third of our country has about 4 meals in the past 7 days that include beef. 4 versus 6 may not sound like a big number, but that difference of 2 times a country of over 300 million, it ends up real quick. We have similar information in there about expenditures. So you also find in the May report, one of the figures I included is your estimated food expenditures at home versus away from home. And the punchline here, to put a bow on all this for us, Shelby, is as your finances are declining, you're telling me you're spending a lot less on food away from home. So the biggest adjustment that occurs, and I've been saying this for months consecutively, it's not a new story, we just continue to see it, is you're spending less on food away from home. And by extrapolation, you're spending less on meat away from home. So the food service channel in particular, right, restaurants et al., faces the biggest challenge from this macroeconomic uncertainty. When you dig a little deeper into this, the public's concerns about unemployment and inflation are quite inflated compared to when we started the year. And I think that's given at least a subset of the public some pause. They definitely want meat protein. I kind of skipped over that for the sake of time here today, but there's more of those details in the MDM. So there's not a lack of desire. People want meat protein, but there's this affordability and what my future finances pessimism looks like. That's sort of getting in the road of that. And that's what underlies my choppy waters is my best forecast when you asked me a few minutes ago.
Glynn, can you remind us where people can find all this information?
Yeah, everything we referenced, so the feedlot returns as well as the MDM and other nuggets that we've talked about here, you can find cross-linked on our AgManager.info website. And if at any time you struggle to find it, you're welcome to email me. Just Google my last name. You'll find the K-State email, and I'm happy to connect you with this and related information.
Glynn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about termites and ants with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, my pleasure, anytime.
Jeff, why have you been receiving quite a few questions about termites and ants?
Well, it does seem like a little late in the year before I started getting calls, and from a normal or an average perspective, it is. Ants and termites generally swarm about the same time due to about the same conditions. I'm not exactly sure what those conditions are, but in general, anytime we get warm spring rains or high humidity, and generally when I say spring, I'm talking April, I start getting calls about ant and termite swarms. But they can actually start swarming, I've seen them in late February through March, April, and into May. Now, I'm talking about the primary swarm of an ant or a termite colony. We can get secondary swarms in the summer or in the fall, but those are generally a lot smaller. A lot of times people don't even hardly notice those. But that primary swarm in the spring is really noticeable usually because it involves thousands, tens and hundreds of thousands of individual, whether it's termites mainly or ants. So the question that I always get is, how do you tell the difference? It's very important to know the difference because to get a termite treatment, we really recommend you get a professional pest control operator, pest control company to treat for termites. Ants, on the other hand, a lot of times you can do it yourself. But the main difference, and I'm talking about the swarmers, those that are actually flying out of the ground, out of the nest area, those are all male or females, drones or queens, whatever you want to call them. They're winged. Whether it's an ant or a termite, they're dark colored. They're either, a dark mahogany brown or a black. They're about the same color. They have about the same shape, same kind of wings. But once you see them up close, it's really easy to tell the difference. The swarmer termite, the winged reproductive termite, has a body that's more cigar-shaped. Reproductive ant has a body that has a very constricted or restricted waist, a very noticeable waist. So that's one easily distinguishable difference between ants and termites. The second, if they still have their wings on, the termites have 4 wings of equal size. They have a front pair and a back pair, and they're of equal size. The ants have 4 wings also, but the front pair is a lot larger than the hind pair. A lot of times that's a little difficult to notice. But the third distinguishing characteristic is really easily seen, and that is the termite has antennae that come out from the head and they go straight out. And they're kind of beaded if you look at them up close. But if you look at the head of the ant swarmer, they have antennae that we call are elbowed. They come out from the head and they go up at a 90-degree angle. So they're elbowed or they're bent. Really, once you see them, it's really easy to distinguish the difference. But they're both relatively active. The thing is, when they swarm, we call it flying out, but it's more of a flutter. They don't really fly well, neither ants nor termites. So when they come out, it usually gets your attention, or really what gets your attention is all the birds. The birds will notice a swarm if they're coming out of a stump out in the yard or someplace out in the yard. The birds they really like to pick them off as they flutter around. And I've also seen toads, lizards, all kinds of stuff. So there's very few of them actually live to start a new colony. But like I said, these swarms are composed of thousands of individuals, so it doesn't take very many to find a safe place to start a new colony. So that swarming activity, usually in Kansas over the last 40 years that I've been noticing, it usually starts about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning as it starts warming up. It's usually a few days after a rain. I think that's why we're seeing a lot of swarms now. We've finally been getting some rain in the last, 10 to 14 days, and that's raised the humidity, and it's caused these both termites and ants to swarm. The swarm is actually when they're dispersing from the old colony, the old nest site, looking for a new place to start a colony. So that's what you want to do. You want to make sure if you see the swarm, you want to note that there's a colony there, an existing colony. They've been there for 3 or 4 years. They don't just swarm every year. It takes a while for them to build up to enough to actually kick out some more reproductives to go look for another place to start a nesting site. But it's very important you tell the difference between ants and termites, because ants, like I said, for the most part, you can take care of those yourself. They'll trail into your house, and you can disrupt the trail. They leave a chemical called a pheromone. They'll leave a chemical trail so that hundreds can follow it to wherever the food source is that they found, and then they go back to the nest at night. And so all you have to do is disrupt, interrupt, spray around that area, and that will disrupt that trailing ability. And the best thing is if you can find the nest, you can treat that little area where the nest is. Termites, on the other hand, we really recommend you get a professional, because it usually takes specialized equipment to get to where the termites are. Termites are really easily killed. The workers are soft-bodied, white insects. They are killed in sunlight. They're killed if they dry out. The humidity has to be just right. That's why they're called, the termites we have in Kansas are called subterranean termites, because they have to build from their nest site. They have to build earthen tunnels up to wherever they're finding food, whatever part of your house or your structure they're feeding on, or barn or whatever it is, because they have to keep it dark inside there, and they have to control the humidity as it evaporates up from the ground. It keeps it relatively cool and damp inside those tunnels where those workers are actually feeding on the whatever they're feeding on, whatever wood or cellulose structure they're feeding on. So what you need to do is get the insecticide to where the nest is and kill out the nest of the termites. Otherwise, if you just disrupt their trail like you do the ants, they'll just set another trail into your house and start feeding on a different part of your house. Ants, on the other hand, they're just scavengers. They're not feeding on the house, and they're just looking for crumbs or something that they can feed on. So they're much easier to take care of or to control than termites.
If someone has termites, are they likely to have ants and vice versa? That's
a good question. That's something I always forget. If termites, their arch enemy are ants. So if there's any ants around, you won't have any termites. If you have any old damage, you're wondering if it's termites. If you see ants, the ants are taking care of the termites. They won't. They're enemy. So if you have ants in one location, you're not going to have termites there. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have termites in your house, because you can have ants on the south side of the house, termites on the north side. I'm just saying in that area, wherever the ants are, they will limit the termite activity to below ground, and the termites don't have enough. They have a few, mostly the colony is mostly made up of workers that are feeding on the cellulose, but they will have a few soldier termites, but there's not enough to control the ants. So wherever you have ants, you can be pretty well assured that you're not going to have termites. If you can't tell the difference, make sure you call a professional to come in and tell the difference between the termites and the ants, because like I said, termites cost a lot more to control than do the ants. And they're both, right now, this time of year, and it looks like we're going to get more rain and warm weather for the next week or two, they're both swarming, so that's a good time to get out and identify if you do have a termite problem or not. Just because you have it in the yard doesn't mean you have it in your house. They normally feed on old decaying roots or tree stumps or any kind of old wood in the yard, but that doesn't mean they're in the house. Once they run out of that, that's when they start sending out workers to look for another suitable source of food, and that's when they'll often, come into something that we build our houses out of, i.e. wood, and that's where we get in conflict with the termites.
Do we have to worry about another swarm later in the year, or do they just eventually go away?
Well, you say worry about, they will swarm 2 or 3 times a year. The swarm in the spring is called the primary swarm. They will often, if the food source is plentiful and they're developing well, they will often produce what we call secondary swarms, ants and or termites. They can do that in the summer. It'll be after a rain. They have to have high humidity. Or it could be in the fall. They can produce these secondary swarms. But that just means they're doing their primary colony is doing well, and they're doing so well, they're kind of outrunning their food source. So they're sending scouts out in the way of males and females to mate and try and find a new place to successfully start a new colony. But that's a good question. But it all is predicated upon moisture. It's fueled, or it's started, or it's initiated by warm, moist conditions. Again, in the spring. In Kansas, it's usually April. I've seen it in February, March. That's the primary swarm. A lot of times after that, they may not swarm for another 2 years, but that doesn't mean they're not there. The whole colony doesn't leave during that swarm. The workers will be left, the queen will be left, and they will continue to feed on whatever they're feeding on. It just means they've produced enough in that area that they want to start other colonies elsewhere.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about piping plovers with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, what is a piping plover?
Yeah, a piping plover is a type of shorebird, and so there are these birds that like to walk along the edge of shores, as their name implies. So they like to be near bodies of water, open areas. There are actually some that live in grasslands, but they're these small birds, a little bit bigger than a sparrow, and they like to walk along these open areas, have really long legs, really long beaks a lot of times. So a unique group of birds I thought we could chat about.
What are some specific characteristics for a piping plover?
Piping plovers are an endangered type of plovers. They're an endangered type of shorebird. They have gray backs, white bellies, yellow legs, and they have a dark band around their neck. But they're an endangered species, so their populations have declined. The Audubon Society in 2006, I think, the early 2000s, listed the piping plover as one of its top 10 endangered species to think about. So it's a shorebird that has population declines, and there's recently been one one spotted in Kansas. So I thought it was a good topic for us to talk about.
Where is it in Kansas?
Yeah, so it's at Webster State Park, and that is in Rooks County, which is just north of Hays. And so on the beach there's a nest, a confirmed nest. They have the area taped off with caution tape, but you can still go from a safe distance with binoculars and see the piping plover if you'd like to.
Is this something that's commonly found in Kansas?
You know, these birds pass through, and so Kansas is a flyway, and these birds are migrating really long distances. And so I wouldn't say that it's common to see them. They have a relatively low population size because they are endangered, but they do stop here. Kansas has a lot of habitat. Cheyenne Bottoms is a wetland that's really known for having a great diversity of shorebirds, and so occasionally we'll see them, but it is kind of a big deal that this piping plover is in Kansas. So if you really like birding, great opportunity to get out and see them.
How many offspring does a piping plover usually have?
Yeah, so this nest that they have in Webster, I don't know how big its clutch is, and clutch is the number of eggs. But on average, they're going to have about 4 eggs in a clutch. And so sometimes they'll have 5, sometimes they'll have 3, but on average, it's going to be 4 different eggs. And hopefully those offspring can grow up and survive. The piping plovers are monogamous, so they mate with the same individual their entire life. They're going to have those offspring. The offspring, when they wake up, they can act just like an adult. So they generally are leaving the nest pretty quickly after they're hatched.
What are they eating?
Most of the time they have really long beaks or bills, and so those allow them to get down into some of those wetter habitats that we think about and get a lot of different invertebrates. So they're primarily eating different types of bugs that we would see on the shoreline. Some of them can get deeper and get worms or something like that, but a lot of times they're going along the edge of the shore looking for different types of aquatic invertebrates or maybe some terrestrial ones that are on that shoreline too.
And before the interview, you mentioned something called the broken wing distraction. And what's that?
You know, we get calls saying, hey, there's this bird that has a broken wing. It's injured. And it's a really cool technique that a lot of these different birds have where they can kind of walk with their wing in a funky position. They squawk a lot. They're making a lot of noise. And so people think they're injured. And if you don't see it a lot, it would look just like the bird has a broken wing and it's calling out for help. But really what it's doing is it's saying, hey, my nest is over there and I want you, they think you're a predator, they want you to get distracted and chase them instead of going and finding their eggs or their new young that are hatching. And so we get calls a lot, people worried about there being an injured bird. Most of the time it's this broken wing technique where that bird is mimicking an injury to help keep a predator away from its nest.
So something that other birds besides just the piping plover does?
Yeah, so this is really common in the shorebirds. There's another bird called a killdeer, which is a much more common type of shorebird that we would have in Kansas, and they show this technique often as well. And so it's something that we can see fairly often when we're in shoreline habitats or habitats where these shorebirds are, but the piping plover is known to do it too. So if you're out looking at the nest and you see that injured wing, it's probably nothing to worry about.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.